Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. We have people from all over attending this session. So welcome to the session of the Amazon Consumer Science Summit 2020 virtual edition. My name is Mauricio Rezende, and I will be the moderator of this session. And welcome, Anna Nagurney.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So Professor Nagurney will be giving a pre-recorded talk titled Optimization of Food Supply Chain Networks, Why Quality, Trade Instruments, and Labor All Matter. So Anna is John F. Smith Memorial Professor at the Isenberg School of Management at UMass Amherst. She's also director of the Virtual Center for Super Networks, which she founded in 2001. She holds Bachelor of Science, Bachelor of Arts, Master of Science, and PhD degrees from Brown University. And she's a prolific author. She's authored 14 books, written over 200 papers, and also over 50 book chapters. Anna has been visiting scholar at many institutions around the world, and she's been recognized as a role model for young women in STEM. She was the first woman awarded the Konstantin Karatetori Prize by the International Society of Global Optimization back last year, and only the second woman earlier this year in the 35 history of the Harold Lardner Prize awarded this prize. And that's given by the Canadian Operations Research Society. Anna's research focuses on networks, so it focuses on all types of networks, including transportation networks, logistical networks, financial, social networks, and also the topic of this talk, the topic of this talk, which is food supply networks. During her talk, I urge you to ask questions by entering them in the chat box on the right, and at the end, she'll have the opportunity of answering some of these questions. And after the session is over, Anna will be available to meet you in a virtual coffee break on Chime. The link to this Chime room is in the program. So Anna, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to give this talk, and I hope everyone.
Thank you.
Yes, and I hope everyone enjoys. I'm sure they will. Everyone who enjoys this very interesting talk. So I think we can roll the video.
Greetings. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you today. It's a great honor. I'm very, very excited to be sharing our latest research related to food supply chain networks. The title of my presentation today is Optimization of Food Supply Chain Networks, Why Quality, Trade Instruments, and Labor All Matter. So I'll be giving you a panoramic view of the work that we have been doing, which I think should be of great interest to all the Amazonians. I also would like to congratulate you. I think the theme of this Consumer Science Summit, Economic Decision-Making at Scale, is absolutely perfect. So before I begin, special thanks to the organizing committee of the 2020 Amazon Consumer Science Summit for this invitation, and special thanks to my summit buddy, Dr. Mauricio Rezende. I would be remiss also not to acknowledge Whole Foods and Amazon Pantry, which have been absolute lifesavers during this COVID-19 pandemic. The presentation that I'm giving today is being dedicated to all essential workers. Thank you so very, very much. So this is the outline of my presentation. I will begin with some motivation and some background, and then I'll discuss how we capture quality in food supply chain networks. We use an interdisciplinary approach. I think is very, very relevant because many consumers now really care about their product quality. Then I will transition to something which maybe isn't getting as much attention now in the pandemic, but it's also extremely relevant. And that has to do with different trade instruments and impacts. I will also be discussing some of our latest research on how one could incorporate labor and labor disruptions into supply chain networks. And I will be specifically talking about the impacts of labor disruptions on food supply chain networks, from meat to also fresh produce. I will conclude my presentation with a discussion of how we in operations research, operations management, and analytics are actually impacting policy now, which I think is extremely gratifying. So thank you for joining. So first, some background. I've always been obsessed with network systems in many different kinds of configurations, from congested urban transportation networks to complex supply chain networks. We've even had several National Science Foundation grants to try and envision the internet, which I think is very, very cool. And what we're interested in is modeling the behavior of different decision makers and users on these networks. So we're interested in also the underlying economics, the profits, the flows, and so on. So much of my research, though, in the past 10 years or so has focused on supply chain networks, because you have many interacting decision makers there. They might have different criteria that they seek to optimize. So these are really complex networks, and they're fascinating in terms of applications. We've done work on energy networks, a lot of work in healthcare, and in addition, disaster relief, and of course, in terms of food, and that's the topic of today's presentation. So I believe in writing books, and most of the books that I've actually authored or co-authored have a network theme, from network economics, that was the first book I ever wrote, to fragile networks, which I think is extremely relevant now with all just disruptions we're having in terms of flows and even infrastructure issues. Also, I've written, co-authored a book on financial networks and, of course, super networks. And I'm actually the founding director of the Virtual Center of Super Networks at UMass Amherst, which I founded almost 19 years ago, just before 9/11. So the approach that we take to food is definitely multidisciplinary. And I think what is really exciting about this is we bring say, different scientific perspectives to modeling food and, in general, perishable products supply chains. We bring in the physics, the chemistry, the biology. So as I tell my students, you never know what kinds of courses will be useful in your research long term, so you should be studying as much as possible. So to show that the work does get recognized and noticed, on September 9th, I was quoted in an article in the New York Times. It was a 2-page article on food that was authored by a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, Kim Severson. It got reprinted in the Boston Globe, and the quotes are being highlighted in other publications. So this is to say that the work that we do in academia does get noticed, and I'll be talking a little bit about how to deal with the media and so on to get the work out into the public, which I think is extremely important now. So what about quality and food supply chain networks? And some might say, well, how do we model quality? Different products might have different attributes, different characteristics. So there is a lot of discussion having to deal with, how do you capture quality? What is nice about food supply chain networks is that food scientists have actually constructed all sorts of different formulae where you can measure how the attribute of particular foods, and specifically fresh produce, actually decay over time. So that I think is so cool. So let me get to this. And also I think in this COVID-19 pandemic, which was declared by the World Health Organization on March 11th, 2020, we're seeing the importance of food. Okay? Sometimes, we haven't been able to get the meat that we want. We've been running out of spaghetti. And it's not just, the cleaning supplies, but also it's different kinds of food products. People are buying a lot of oranges now. They really care about quality and health for their families and themselves. And also these food supply chain networks have suffered, major disruptions during the pandemic. So when it comes to food supply chains, our work begins in 2013. We actually published a paper in the European Journal of Operational Research, which was recognized at a conference in Poznan, Poland, as being one of the most impactful journal articles in that specific journal, published over a couple of years. So that was a great honor. And what we have to realize is food, even under the best circumstances, especially fresh produce, dairy, and meat, actually is always decreasing in quality over time. Okay, so when you think about, supply chain network consisting of, the producers, the processors, the handlers, the storage, the freight service provision, and so on, you need to capture all those very important network economic activities and supply chain networks and the impacts on food quality. So what I think is so cool is that there are chemical formulae that we can use, which incorporate things such as time, temperature, even humidity. Okay? So you can track the deterioration in quality over space and over time. And here we use differential equations. So for example, if small q is quality and you're interested in determining the rate of change of quality over time, you use different kinds of factors. We have a reaction rate, which is K, and we have what is known as the Arrhenius formula. So you have the temperature in there, you have the activation energy, and even a universal gas constant. And you can see the rate of change of quality over time is equal to a factor, the quality raised to the nth power. And different kinds of produce will decay based upon, the order n. So that is really interesting. There are some that decay according to order n, 0. Okay? So you can see how the decay works over time. And there are others that decay exponentially. So some of our favorite produce now, it's the summertime, north of the equator, the peaches and strawberries, avocados decay using a first order reaction. So what we did in our first paper, we constructed an oligopoly model in which we had the firms competing. And the consumers, in much of our work, they care about product differentiation and they care about quality. So in their demand price functions, they will respond not only in terms of quantity, but also in terms of the quality. Okay? And in this paper, we also were really interested in the profits the firms would get, in addition to the waste that would propagate. So associated with different links in a supply chain network of a particular firm, you would have an arc multiplier. And as the food would move across the different pathways, you would have a certain amount that would actually essentially decay, and that would result in waste. So you would have a different amount that would actually arrive at the various demand points at the demand markets. And the firms were interested in maximizing profits. That's what firms do in terms of sustainability, and also there would be a certain weight associated with waste minimization. So that was our first very general paper associated with fresh produce, food supply chains, and competition. Then we went further with a former student of mine, now a professor, Dr. Dana Spacek. We decided to focus on farmers markets because I know there are a lot of challenges, and I live in Western Massachusetts. And we wanted to see how we could incorporate these specific food science formulae. And consumers then at the farmers markets would be able to respond. Okay? So we collected data from local farmers markets and local farmers as well, and to see how the quality would be impacted, and also the profits that the various farmers would have. And we studied disruptions. Okay, obviously, farmers are subject to the vagaries associated with weather, climate change, droughts, and so on, frost. So that was really important to be able to study the various disruptions. And also what we did then in a following article, we used as a strategic variable not only the path flows that the farmers, the firms could choose, but also the initial qualities. So the greater the initial quality that, say, a food firm would invest in, that would propagate in a different way. But there, of course, would be an associated cost. And in this model, the consumers would respond to the average quality, because you may have many different kinds of pathways, and that's what they would see at the retail markets, at the grocery stores, and so on. But again, we deal with differentiated products. So here we also have very general supply chain networks. And what it allows you to do is you can study what happens if you add a demand market, what happens if you add, another freight service provider, another storage unit, another warehouse, and so on. So once you have a really nice model and effective algorithm implemented in good code, you can do numerous sensitivity analysis. And that, I think, is the power of our approach. Okay, so now, once you do a quite general framework to study product differentiation and competition in differentiated product markets, it's interesting always to see how the work might be related to different applications. This is something, practitioners love, students love, and I love as well. So the other kinds of perishable products that we have been doing a lot of work on are also arise in healthcare. We work in pharmaceutical products where you also have perishability. And now with, hopefully a vaccine, many vaccines against COVID-19 on the horizon, maybe more long-term than short-term, we're going to need to have an effective cold chain. So this is very relevant. And also in this model, again, it was like a generalized supply chain network oligopoly model. We investigated the impacts of generic competition, and it reproduced actually what was happening in reality with a major pharmaceutical farm, which was losing its patent rights, which I thought was really exciting. And this, we allowed for direct shipments because e-commerce is very important. People, need to get their meds sometimes directly delivered to their homes. Okay, also, who would think that fast fashion is a perishable product? But for many consumers, that actually is. So we also have done work on fast fashion where, in addition to the profits and objective functions, we substitute, for example, emission reduction, because amazingly, some fashion firms such as H&M actually do care about the environment, which is also gratifying. Okay. And then finally, I would like to emphasize here, we're doing optimization of the whole supply chain network. This was work that we've done that was inspired by the Red Cross, which was facing a lot of challenges in the blood services industry. So we were able to study the supply chain network, which is quite complex. There are different kinds of tiers, and what's fascinating about this application is a product you can't be produced. You have to be willing to donate, and obviously in the COVID pandemic, there are a lot of challenges associated with blood and blood shortages. Okay. So now I would like to transition to trade instruments and impacts, and also be bringing in quality issues and how trade instruments actually affect quality as well. So what we've seen in the pandemic vividly illustrated is, how global in nature many of our supply chain networks are, not only in terms of food, but also in medical supplies. For example, PPEs, we've had major shortages. Regional government states are clamoring, as well as healthcare organizations. And that's still an issue now in September. Okay, so interestingly enough, not only historically, but even for the past couple of years, and now even more so when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic, there have been a lot of trade instruments that have been instituted by governments. Okay, typically, nation's government will want to protect its workers, perhaps its consumers. Okay, but we'll be showing you the ramifications and the impacts who wins and who loses. But it is a highly competitive global environment, okay, for many different kinds of products. So here, this is a very nice map. I like this, having to do with the world's biggest importers. And you see China is a huge importer of different kinds of products, as is the United States. But the kinds of trade instruments that we've been modeling and studying, and it brings, the synthesis of operations research, operations management with economics, I think, in a very nice way, are the following. We've been doing a lot of work in tariffs, which we've actually worked on for 20 years, beginning with the dairy industry, quotas, and a combination thereof, which I'm going to share with you, a model which we developed, tariff rate quotas. And they're kind of unique, and they're kind of challenging to model, but also very, very cool. Before the pandemic, almost every single day for months on end, one of the top stories on the first page of New York Times, Washington Post would be something on tariffs and trade wars. It'd be the U.S. Imposing some sort of tariff on some products coming from China. China would retaliate, and it would go on and on. So that's from just over a year ago. Okay, a major headline in the New York Times. Now, this is something not so many are aware of. Okay, there are quite a few countries now globally that have instituted trade instruments having to do not only with medical supplies, but also with food in the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, we have the Philippines have restricted poultry imports from Brazil. Okay? Nigeria has restricted imports of different food products. Then you have China reducing tariffs on agricultural products and also on certain meats, because they're seeing their consumers are suffering. There have been a lot of issues with shortages of pork there because of different kinds of swine flu and so on. So you're seeing temporary export measures, restrictions of products the countries are producing, they're not allowing them to flow out, and also temporary import measures. Some countries are actually worried about different food products actually bringing in the disease. I mean, it hasn't been really scientifically substantiated, but it makes sense, okay, that they would want to protect their populations, their consumers. I find this absolutely fascinating. And there's a lot of also policy instruments being implemented on reducing tariffs on important products for a country's citizens. So you can see, pharma, food, and food, which, not many people are aware of. And I feel that's really, really interesting. So I believe that our research community and also practitioners need to focus more on constructing computable operational mathematical models that allow policymakers, decision makers, various governments, assess the impacts of different trade instruments. I think that's extremely important. And it's not just focusing on the firms within your nation, but also what is the impact on consumers, on you, on me. Okay, so this is something I'll be discussing. And it's also very challenging, but rewarding research. So this part of the presentation is based on the following paper that we published in the Journal of Global Optimization, and I'll be talking about tariff rate quotas, okay, and with application to agricultural products. Now, what is interesting about tariff rate quotas, these are two-tiered tariffs. You have essentially a quota that is imposed on a particular product, and a lower tariff if the shipments in do not exceed that quota. On the other hand, you're allowed to have the imports exceed the quota, but associated with that will be a higher tariff and over quota. So it's kind of a stepwise function. It's interesting. And you might not be aware of this, but the Uruguay round in 1996 induced the creation of more than 1,300 new TRQs, which is a lot. And the world's four most important food crops, rice, wheat, corn, and bananas, have all been subject to tariff rate quotas. So it definitely makes sense to do research in this area. Now, there has been work done on perfect competition and tariff rate quotas using typically a spatial price equilibrium kind of framework. So that's something we have done a lot of work on for many years. And our first tariff rate quota in terms of kind of a spatial price equilibrium framework was a recent European Journal of Operational Research paper, which we published in 2019. But now we're interested in oligopolistic competition because some of the food firms, you know, they're big, it's like agribusinesses. So we'd like to study the impacts. And what our framework allows one to do is we're not limited to, you know, specific functional forms. We're not into just analytical solutions. We have the algorithms to compute solutions. So you can have nonlinear functions, you can have a lot of asymmetries, you can have interactions, very general demand price functions, and so on. And we think that's the power of our methodological framework. So I'll be showing you a global supply chain network model, okay, where you can have firms in many different countries, and the governments will be imposing tariff rate quotas, and I'll discuss some of the highlights and managerial insights that we've derived from a case study on avocados, which is a very, very popular fruit now in the United States and also in China because of its health benefits. So you can see that I'm obsessed with networks. This is the supply chain network topology for our model with TRQs. You have different firms that are competing, and they have production sites in different countries, and also their demand markets in different countries. So here we identify different groups. So the government will say impose a tariff rate quota on, say, certain demand markets in their country, it could be all, and certain, say, producing firms in different countries. And associated with each group will be an under quota tariff, TUGG, and also an over quota tariff. So the strategic variables that the firms have is to identify these QIHLs. It will be the quantity of a particular product manufactured or produced by firm I at a production site H, and then shipped to a demand market L for consumption. And also here, something that's very important, we have a certain Lagrange multiplier associated with groups, okay, and kind of the quota. And that is, in more economic language, denoting that quota rent equivalent for a particular group. So what is the data that we use? You have certain production functions associated with the production sites the firms have. You, of course, have transportation cost functions, which is very important. You have conservation of flow equations and demand price functions. And the demand, say, at a certain demand market can depend upon the demand for the products in the various demand markets within the own region, country, or maybe even in other countries. So what is the utility function? Say each firm, say I, is interested in maximizing its profits. So you have the revenue minus the total production cost, minus the total transportation cost, and then you have this certain term that is added, which captures the under tariff, and if the firm goes above the quota, you capture in equilibrium also that equivalent rent, okay, Lagrange multiplier. So you see, it's very, very cool. And then if you don't have that, okay, then you have just standard kind of utility maximization, which has to do with profits of a particular firm. So that would be a special case. So what is the definition? This is a Nash equilibrium problem. We have that each firm wants to maximize its profits to do as best as it possibly can. And associated also is another set of equilibrium conditions which captures the over tariff quota and the under tariff quota. So if you have, say, the shipments going in exceed the quota, this will make sure that the tariff is actually incorporated into the utility function. And if you don't have, say, for example, the shipments exceeding or meeting the strict quota for the group, then the price, the economic rent, is actually equal to zero. And it works out very, very elegantly. So the methodology we use for a lot of our models is that of the theory of variational inequalities, which is, you can think of it as a generalization of optimization theory, very useful for game theory and other kinds of problems. So it allows, under certain assumptions, for us to formulate very general equilibrium conditions as a single inequality, which is known as a variational inequality. So you see that here we have the marginal utility functions with respect to the strategic variables. And also we have an additional term which has to do with the quota and the economic rent equivalence. So we're interested in analyzing this problem and getting the solutions. And if you don't have TRQs, then it collapses the formulation to this very nice and elegant variational inequality formulation, which is just in the product flows as strategic variables. So also, this model has a special cases. You might just have unit tariffs, which makes sense. And also, we can handle strict quotas, in which case the Nash equilibrium conditions, because you can't exceed the strict quota, becomes a generalized Nash equilibrium problem, which is also very, very cool. And then lots of many other applications. You might have different decision makers competing, for scarce resources. So they have common constraints, they have shared constraints. So the Nash equilibrium concept is no longer sufficient, but you need a generalization to a generalized Nash equilibrium concept. So we did a case study in this paper having to deal with avocados, and Mexico is a big supplier, and also China. And there's been a trade war in this market. And very interestingly, that now the volume of avocados consumed in the US has amazingly surpassed the volume of bananas. So this is, I think, is pretty cool. And you see, again, front page of the New York Times, there were tariffs imposed on this very, very popular and nutritious product. So I think this is also many hipsters, millennials, they love the guacamole. So tariffs are coming for your guacamole. Okay, so what we found in our analyses is, well, first, in terms of literature, there's not much work that has been done in terms of imperfectly competitive firms and supply chain networks and TRQs. The variational equality framework is very elegant, both theoretically and computationally. And we were able to do, many different kinds of scenario analyses, which, you can look at our paper. But the thing is, what happens to consumers? Well, our results demonstrate unequivocally TRQs can be effective in reducing product flows from countries on which they are imposed, okay? But that at the expense of consumers in terms of prices. So governments will be protecting their firms, okay, their producers, but consumers are suffering. And this keeps on coming over and over again. I'll show you the impacts on quality. Okay, so then we began to investigate, what about if you have quality also as a strategic variable? Can we do some analyses of, the impacts of trade policies on quality and also profits of firms? So we published a paper last year in Transportation Research E, and there we investigated tariffs or strict quotas on consumer welfare. Okay, so what is the impact on consumers? So again, we had a supply chain network topology. And what we found that, first of all, there's a really equivalence equivalence between imposing a strict quota and also tariffs. If a strict quota is tight and you have that Lagrange multiplier be a corresponding tariff, you will get the same product flows in the solution as well as the same product quality. So this is kind of neat, okay? it's pretty clear, that governments would prefer tariffs to strict quotas because they get the income then from the tariffs. But still, it gives governments the flexibility of doing one or the other. Okay? And then we did a case study on soybeans. That's also a very important product for China, for the US, especially for our farmers. And China has been a great importer of soybeans because of its rapidly increasing population size. And the US actually is a big exporter, but also because of the tariffs and the trade war associated with this product, we had other countries in South America, Brazil and Argentina, actually gaining more of the market, which was really, really interesting. And in this study, we did all sorts of analyses focusing on major firms in the US who are exporters of soybeans. And this is the power of our methodology. You can do sensitivity analysis, infinite number of possibilities, which is good. But the punchline, from the consumer's perspective, results consistently and unanimously show consumer welfare declines for consumers in the country, imposing a strict quota or tariff on the imported product. Okay, so we're really arguing for free trade. Hence, a government may wish to loosen a quota, equivalently reduce a tariff, so as not to adversely affect its own consumers, especially during the pandemic. Okay. Now, producing firms, what they really should do on these competitive supply chain networks, they should expand the demand markets within their own countries, and that's been happening. That's very effective, very basic kind of redesign of the supply chain network under a tariff or quota, and it results in higher profits for firms. Also, firms should expand number of production sites to countries which aren't subject to these. So some are doing that in the US, going to Mexico, for example. So they are more resilient when it comes to such trade policy instruments. In governments, we can see that the tariffs might still continue, okay, and quotas, but clearly governments, they prefer tariffs because of the financial benefits that they can get. The impacts on trade flows can be substantial. So other work that we've done on quality is, what if, firms actually want to compete in terms of supply chain network quality? And there you have quality in terms of perishable products, non-perishable products, also quality in terms of freight service provision, which is something really important because you don't want your perishables deteriorating during the transportation process. And here we identify all sorts of different network topologies, even when it comes to, multi-tier supply chain networks. And we have measures of performance, which is very important in this day and age. If, say, how do you identify which is the most important supplier in your supply chain network? How do you identify and rank maybe the freight service providers? Okay, because those are the ones you should invest in. If you knock out a particular supplier, it might have major ramifications to your profits and to the very viability of your supply chain network. So this is a book which was a finalist for a major prize in Europe. We didn't get it, but it was still a great honor to be nominated, considered. So now let me transition to something which we've been working on very, very intently during the pandemic. And here what we're doing is really integrating kind of economics again and operations research, operations management to focus on general supply chain networks, but with inclusion of labor. Because this is something that has been dramatically illustrated in the pandemic. What happens if you have insufficient labor? What happens if the labor is not as productive because they might be getting ill? Okay, some of them are actually perishing. And this has ramifications throughout the supply chain network. So let me show you what we've been doing. And we were inspired because of, the losses and the suffering. And also the importance, of essential workers and the importance of all us having healthy food and nutrition as we battle this pandemic. So some of the most vivid news, I think, dramatic news was the number of illnesses in meat processing plants. Meat processors tend to be, it's an oligopoly. And if something happens, to one of the 4 major meat processors, and many of them were getting shut down, you can see that, we are having meat shortages in terms of beef, chicken, and also pork. The prices are rising. They continue to rise. Okay. And that happened even in the organic chicken market, which I thought was really interesting. And also, I should mention, it's not just a matter in terms of meat processing that we've seen major disruptions in this COVID-19 pandemic, but also in terms of fresh produce and processing. Many of the workers that do the harvesting are migrant workers. Some of them have been getting really ill, and as they're moving up to the Northeast, from Florida all the way up to Maine and even on the West Coast, we're seeing major shortages in terms of labor, now specifically in Maine for blueberry picking. And it's horrible when you think, there's so much food insecurity in the US and other parts of the world, but still farmers had to cull their animals. And what could be more painful for farmers? And not to mention all the economic losses. Okay, also because the difficulty of transportation and so forth, and actually the migrant workers moving from other countries, from Mexico, for example, to the US, and this is global in nature, okay, even in Europe, it's hard to get sufficient volume of labor to do the harvesting now. Okay, also we are seeing complete disruption in supply chain networks having to do with food because, the businesses closed, the schools closed, restaurants closed, and so on. So we really have to re-envision, redesign our food supply chain networks. And also recently, the New York Times in its Sunday magazine section had a full themed issue focusing on food insecurity and hunger, which is really, really painful to see. So something needs to be done about this. So the news about the food disruptions, it was not only national in scope, but it was international in scope. So we just got our adrenaline going and focus and said, let's study this. So the first paper that I wrote, incorporating labor into general supply chain networks, focused on perishable food supply chain networks in the COVID pandemic. And it's a paper which is coming out in a book that I'm co-editing with my colleagues, Ilias Koutsirias and Panos Pardalos. This is the third in a series that we've co-edited together, focusing on dynamics of disasters, impact, risk, and resilience and solutions. And what we're dealing with in the COVID-19 pandemic is a major healthcare disaster. So lack of availability of labor is one of the drivers of supply chain disruptions. If you don't have labor to harvest, if you don't have labor to do the processing, these are critical links in supply chain networks. You're not going to have the food moving from the origin nodes to the destination nodes. And you might have a complete disruption, like a closing of a plant, or you might have, say, a reduction in capacity because you don't have enough labor. So this is something we were interested in studying. And also we're seeing, even in our community, farmers are kind of trying to sell more directly to consumers. Obviously, Amazon has been brilliant with electronic commerce. So we have in our supply chain network, this perishable food one, also direct links going from, say, production harvesting sites to points of demand. Right? They could be, for example, grocery stores, or they could be, say, you and I, our homes that are being directly supplied with nourishing food. But you see, this can be quite complicated. It depends on the particular food product that you're working on. And here we also handle the perishability as we did in the first paper, which I discussed with you today. The European Journal, it was published in the European Journal of Operational Research. But we incorporated labor in the following way. Okay, we had associated with each link in the supply chain network a certain capacity of labor. And using kind of economic production functions, we were able to map the availability of labor into the production in terms of flow in a particular link. And associated with each link would also be a productivity factor, because we think that's really important. There might be some workers who, for various reasons, might not be as productive in this stressful period now. Okay, so how would that affect the prices, the profits of the firms and the availability of the products to the consumers? And also, as I mentioned, we wanted to avail ourselves of being able to analyze direct sales, whether farmers markets, nearby farm stands, or even directly to consumers. So what we found in our analyses, which I think is really interesting, that you might have in a supply chain network a disruption even in a single link, such as a freight one, and that might significantly negatively impact our food firms. So it's really important to do these studies in terms of resilience, okay, because these are the ones you should be protecting. Also, preserving productivity and all utilized supply chain network economic activity is critical, since the impact of a drastic reduction in productivity can also severely reduce profits. Okay, direct sales is very, very helpful to maintain or even enhance productivity. And that makes sense, because the pathways are shorter. You're dealing with shorter supply chain paths, and there's less likely to be a disruption. Also, the costs can be lower. Okay. In addition, a firm should be enhancing its marketing. That's really important, online marketing. So consumers are willing to pay, a higher price. They might be more aware of the quality that you're providing, and major profit increases can occur. So now we began to go further and said, okay, that was for an optimization model, firm having control over its perishable product supply chain network. What happens when there are firms now competing for labor, which is happening in many sectors of the economy, because we have labor shortages, those mentioning in terms of migrant workers, in terms of production of PPEs, and so on. So we did a game theory extension of the model that I kind of just highlighted. And there we were able to incorporate different kinds of labor constraints, which I thought was really, really interesting. And the application that we focused on was on migrant workers and the harvesting of fresh produce. So here we have multiple firms that are competing. They have a differentiated product, but it's substitutable. And we consider three different kinds of labor constraints. In the first kind of labor constraint, it was as in the previous model, we would have bounds of labor on specific links. Okay, so that was kind of most restricted. Labor wasn't allowed to move. And then we considered, well, let's suppose we have, say, a fixed amount of labor associated with a tier. So labor can move, say, from different production sites, for example. But still the firms are competing for that fixed amount of labor. And that could also be the case for freight service provision, from storage, and so on. And then finally, we had kind of the most flexible labor constraint. We would have a single bound of labor in the supply chain network economy, and labor could move across firms and across economic activities. Okay, obviously there could be some costs associated with that, but we see that that's actually happening in some countries. For example, in Scandinavia, like SAS, for example, has laid off a lot of its airline employees, but they're being retrained to work as healthcare workers. Okay, so this is something that we thought was really, really interesting. So here I've highlighted, the three different scenarios. And in the case of the first set, that becomes of constraints a classical kind of Nash equilibrium problem. But in the case of the second constraint, when firms are competing for a fixed amount of labor across a tier, that becomes, again, a generalized Nash equilibrium. And obviously, when you have a single labor constraint and labor can move across, the different activities, that also, they share a common constraint. Okay, so they're competing not only through the utility functions, but also through the constraints, because it's common. And this is interesting, that third set of labor, the consulting company McKinsey recently noted that, they are kind of recommending this kind of free mobility of labor. But obviously there are costs, some people might not be willing to, but if you want employment, this might be definitely the way to go. Okay? And that can help in terms of supply chain effectiveness, while also re-envisioning and reforming our supply chain network. So we did a lot of numerical examples documenting potential impacts of labor disruptions under these scenarios. We studied disruptions at manufacturing plants, storage facilities, which is happening, folks. What happens if you add another competitor? What happens to the demand price functions are affected? And also the impacts of labor disruptions, decrease of labor. You can also do, obviously, increase. So I mentioned, the methodological, the equilibrium concept. So let me now highlight how we have, and this is really gratifying, impacted policy through analytics. So I really believe that, and this takes a different mindset, that if you do, a couple of major research studies and publications, one needs to get the news out to the public, to different audiences, because then the policymakers are more likely to see the results of your research, and perhaps you can actually influence policies. So I've been doing a lot of writing, I would say, for the last, definitely 5, 6, 7 years of op-eds, letters to the editor, and so on. I'm a big proponent of writing for the conversation, because then your articles can be reprinted in other media sources, which is really good. And that usually leads to invitations to be on television, to speak on radio programs, and you can further disseminate the results of your studies. And I enjoyed that. Okay, so on March 11, 2020, as I mentioned before, the World Health Organization declared the pandemic. On March 12th, I published an article on blood supply chains. That's a perishable product supply chain that is also related to food, okay, and healthcare in the conversation. And an extension of it also was an invited piece by Informs in its Analytics Coronavirus Chronicles. And the thing is, many countries around the world, starting with China, Iran, where coronavirus, COVID-19 hit before it really came to the United States, they were all suffering from blood shortages. And that's a big, big issue. So I wrote this piece, and then it followed up with, additional media articles. Then I talked about food because it's related. NBC News in Boston, USA Today, Salon, The Verge. And one of my favorite ones was to be on a radio show in Fargo, North Dakota. And there I spoke actually to farmers on various shortages. So what happened? What's the punchline here? Well, on April 22nd, 2020, there was a letter written, and you can see it online, from the California Attorney General, Becerra, to Admiral Brett Giroir, who's the Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And it was signed by U.S. Attorney Generals of 21 other states, including my very own state of Massachusetts, saying that, something needs to be done. We think that some of the restrictions in terms of blood donations discriminate, and some of the restrictions need to be reduced. So my article in the conversation, which was reprinted in Live Science, was the first citation in this document. So I think this is a great honor, a great tribute to the kind of work that we do in operations research and analytics, and we continue to do. So you see some of the signatories. Okay, so with this presentation, I'd like to thank you. We'll be posting the slides from this presentation online on the Virtual Center for Super Networks, and there you can find many other of our publications, our lectures. So I hope you come to visit us, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussions and the Q&A, and thank you so much, and thanks for Amazon for all the great work of your researchers and how you keep us, healthy and supplied with food and many other important products. Thank you.